right now on the ground, still unclear.
Sumi, thank you so much for that. Yeah, we're going to try and explore exactly what this will look like. We can speak to Brian Fonseca, former senior research manager at US Southern Command, former Marine, now director of the Institute for Public Policy at Florida International University. Thank you for coming on the program.
No, thanks for having me.
First of all, your reaction to this idea that the US is now going to run Venezuela?
Yeah, I think what I understood from the president's comments is that the U.S. is going to likely leverage an incredible amount of influence, likely through sectors like the oil sector, as a means of trying to control the temperature and context of which change is going to occur in the coming months and years. And I think that's, that was his emphasis on, again, emphasis on oil sector and leveraging the oil sector as a means of influence. I think that was also sort of insinuated by the fact that Delcy Rodriguez was sworn in as president, and that the U.S. is now talking to members of the regime that are still in place as a modality of transition, to sort of move back to some type of, remnants of democracy. And I also think that was sort of indicated in the fact that he didn't commit boots on the ground in some pronounced context. And so I think what that means is, again, leveraging the oil sector as a means of influencing the texture and pace of change, putting benchmarks in place in order to continue to move power and influence onto those that are being put in positions of power within Venezuela, and of course looking at the role that the opposition and democratic forces will play in the future, as well as those that are still holding positions of influence within the existing government.
Okay, let's just try and unpick that just slightly, just to be clear, because it is slightly confusing. The idea of how one country can run another with no troops on the ground, none of its own politicians in play. So how does this work? You have US companies running the oil industry and then therefore a fair amount of the finances. How does that influence anything else?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it implies that Americans are going to hold political power necessarily. I think there's going to be a process of transitioning political power, governance power to Venezuelans. Again, the president suggested that Delcy Rodriguez may be the person in that position right now. He seemed to say, fairly positive things about that. And so it might indicate that the U.S. is banking on Delcy Rodriguez to serve as president while there is a transition back to democracy, likely through elections in the coming months or the next 18 months or so, in which Venezuelans can elect who they want in positions of political power. I think what that means is, instead of holding political power, and by the way, there may be technical advisors in place, Americans that are playing, technical advisory roles. But I think that the sort of idea of running through the economy is that oil is the largest contributor to the economic solvency of Venezuela, and giving American businesses in the United States greater control over that sort of checkbook may inspire and influence the movement of, sort of the processes of politics that will continue to unfold over the next few months or years. Okay,
just want to move on. You asked about Cuba. What did you take from the replies about Cuba? It's a failing nation. We want to help people of Cuba. Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, saying if I was in the administration, I would be pretty nervous. That's not the exact quote. But what did you make of the tone of those remarks?
No, I mean, I think it definitely suggests that Cuba is certainly on the list, of countries that the United States wants to affect democratic change in. Keep in mind, Secretary Rubio is the son of Cuban immigrants who fled Cuba and landed in Miami, which you have, a huge Cuban diaspora and sort of Cuban American population that would love to see Cuba change. I actually think Cuba may be easier to see a democratic transition, but much more difficult in terms of bringing democratic governance back into play, just because democracy has been absent from Cuba, for 70 years. And so I think that's going to be it's going to be a far more difficult, transition. But I think that for Secretary Rubio, Cuba is probably more important than Venezuela, but the path to Cuba was through Venezuela, which is why Venezuela was first on the secretary's list of countries that it wanted to affect change in.
Okay, just want to ask your thoughts on the military operation. We got that quite late on in the press conference, but we did get a bit of detail about the planning and about the execution of this operation. The idea that Maduro was studied from what he ate to what he wear to his travel arrangements. And then we got the detail about the extraction team and the helicopters flying in low, aeroplanes above taking out air defenses, and the timings of the operations, about 90 minutes or so. What do you make about what we learned there?
Yeah, I mean, it was an incredibly sophisticated and successful, military offensive by the United States. I mean, this is not something that was built and planned overnight. In fact, prior to the administration coming, prior to the Trump administration coming to power, the United States military had plans for all different scenarios in Venezuela. And so, over the last 6 months now, the U.S. has moved massive military assets into the country. I think that despite the fact that the administration tried to stay away from the idea of regime change was always on sort of the list of objectives in terms of building a military capability in the Caribbean to be able to sort of execute something like that. And so I think, again, this has been months in the planning. I think that the execution seemed to be, fairly flawless. We're still going to wait to see the details on sort of the, whether or not those injured, had serious injuries, whether or not there were any civilians, that were collateral damage of American military offensive. I mean, some of those details need to still come out, but it was a massive multi-domain military operation that seems to be incredibly successful and reducing, damage and collateral to Venezuelan American forces. And so, again, it's not something that popped up overnight. This is something that has been months in the planning, and the execution in and of itself was also months in execution in terms of positioning just right to be able to make this kind of run into Caracas under sort of heavily, fortified, positions that the Venezuelan military has put in place over the last several months as well, and execute without any massive collateral damage.
Brian Fonseca, thank you so much for coming on the program and talking us through that. Thank you.